Welcome to our forum on responding to death and end-of-life issues. 5 experts known for their pastoral and theological insights will address this topic tonight, including how to respond to a loved one with dementia and conduct a funeral, the content of Scripture on death, and pastoral care for those who are dying and their families. This webinar stems from the most recent issue of Interpretation, Union Presbyterian Seminary's quarterly peer-reviewed academic journal that covers the field of biblical studies. Our discussion is sponsored by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Leadership Institute, committed to equipping and inspiring church and ministry leaders by providing opportunities for continuing education and development. Check out upcoming workshops, seminars, conferences, online education, and networking opportunities at upsem.edu/upcoming continuing education. The conversation taking place today is similar to the dialogue that happens in our academic classrooms. Union would love to be in touch with you about opportunities to further your theological education. Please contact our admissions office at admissions@upsem.edu. Our panelists are Dr. Trina Armstrong, Director and Founder of Lead Wellness, licensed marriage and family therapist at Center for Wellness Encounters, and a member of the Duke Superfund Advisory Board. Dr. Dawn DeVries, John Newton Thomas Professor of Systematic Theology at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Joel Kaminsky, Morningstar Family Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of Bible in the Religion Department at Smith College. Dr. Thomas Long, Brandy Professor of Preaching Emeritus at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. And Dr. Jim Wright, alumnus and medical director of nursing and assisted living facilities, and founder of Homecoming, which will be the first village in the U.S. constructed specifically for people living with dementia. Our host and moderator is Dr. Samuel Adams, Mary Jane and John F. McNair Chair of Biblical Studies and Professor of Old Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Adams, over to you.
Well, good evening and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us for this, what I hope will be illuminating and important conversation. The book of Psalms wrestles with the fleeting nature of our earthly days and the inevitability of our demise. Psalm 39, 4-5 declares, "Lord, let me know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting my life is. You have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing in your sight. Surely everyone stands as a mere breath." Here the psalmist speaks to the swiftness of life, our desire to understand the implications of our mortality, and the inherent mystery of death. The biblical writers have left us timeless reflections on death, and yet our modern response is often one of denial. We talk about diets and exercise patterns that will prolong our days, surgeries that will restore youthful appearances, and how quickly we can, quote, move on from the loss of a loved one. Yet, as the recent months of the pandemic have reminded us, perhaps more than in many years, death and dying are central aspects of the human experience. And tonight's forum offers us a privileged opportunity to hear 5 timely and creative perspectives on the topic, seasoned by years of research and active pastoral ministry. So, like you, I really look forward to the conversation. I hope you will feel free and want to ask questions in the chat, and we will get to as many of them as possible. Each panelist will take a few minutes to put some ideas on the table. And after that, we'll have a bit of conversation among ourselves, but we should have some considerable time for you to engage directly with us in some free-flowing questions. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Trina Armstrong. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Armstrong.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm grateful to be here, a part of this really exciting conversation, even though the topic is a very difficult topic, right? Particularly in our 18 months, and now that we have been sort of immersed in the body counts of those who are losing their lives to the pandemic. But as you stated, as we're thinking about the topic of death and dying, and particularly in the context of dementia, right? I wanted to just come and share some of my thoughts and reflection about how that's situated in my work, my research, and my work as a pastoral counselor, and even the work that I do now in my wellness organization, where I take all of those learnings, particularly around the topic for me of disenfranchisement, right? We don't really talk a lot about that. And in fact, it's much of what's going on in our society in the context of COVID, but definitely in the context of death and dying. When we think about the topic of disenfranchisement, particularly in grief, and what it means to watch a loved one, a family member, or a friend enter in the process of death and dying. As you stated, Sam, the biblical text, our Christian faith is grounded in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Although we don't really focus much on his death, we move straight to the resurrection, the celebration of his being, ushered into this new life, if you will, right? And it's sort of the foundation of our Christian faith. But there's not a lot of this sitting, this mourning for many of us, and particularly in a lot of the ministry work that I've done. A lot of it is that we have many cultural messages, many things that we have internalized, not only about our mortality, but also what it means to give ourselves permission to feel our emotions, to enter in the process of trying to make meaning of what it means to encounter someone close to us who is in the process of dying. It is still very much a mystery for many people, and there are a lot of assumptions about what that means. So this disenfranchisement doesn't really give people permission, right? It's a lot of those messages that are happening that cuts off an important part of who we are, right? How we are to make sense of this. And in some ways, this meaning-making process is a very spiritual, religious process in terms of how we enter in as the person who's watching it, not necessarily the person who's dying. What does it mean to watch someone who's suffering? As a hospice chaplain, I spent many years doing that, working a lot with dementia and Alzheimer's. And there's an ambiguity to that because the person is physically there, but their own memories, the sufferer themselves doesn't remember the people around them. And the person who's watching that, right, there's a loss in that, right, an ambiguous loss that no one can support that person in that, right? So a lot of how they're processing their own anticipatory grief as they're watching is disenfranchised, right? Nobody knows how to walk alongside of them, know how to make sense of the thoughts and feelings that are, maybe interfering with their daily lives. And so really thinking about how we pay attention to the ways in which we dismiss an important part of who people are, right? That's really happening in the pandemic with this rush of going back to normal, right? And even though we have these astronomical numbers, a friend of mine just visited DC, and there's a whole lawn with white flags representing, just in America, over 600,000 people who've lost their lives. And although that is a ritualistic way to acknowledge the deaths, there's sort of in this rush and not really take into account all of the different losses that a person is encountering that we don't even really understand ourselves, right? The loss of relationship, the loss of hope in a future, the loss of, your own connection to that person's life, and my own assumptions about death and safety and all of these things that there is no place in our society really that can help us to make sense of all of those complicated ways in which we try to make sense of the mystery of death, right? Our avoidance of it, right? And so I do a lot of really talking about disenfranchised grief, mostly to help people to understand that process, right? To enter in times of lament, right? To enfranchise it through ritual, to rethink their cultural values and beliefs around emotions. Many people have had those parts of them cut off because they were given the belief that they're supposed to be acceptable, that we're not supposed to, be curious about some of those things, right? That we're supposed to be perfect as we try to live our lives. But when we have a crisis where we are immersed into death or fear of our own mortality, we mostly do a lot of things to protect ourselves from those vulnerable feelings and emotions, because a lot of how we're expected to be is, right, acceptable by our intelligence, or our ability to be perfect, our ability to, move on and, present ourselves as if these things aren't affecting us. And so a lot of the work that I do as I close my time with this is really helping people to honor their humanity. And it's so biblical. I was working with a woman who is experiencing this very process of making sense of a death of a loved one, and has really had a lot of people disenfranchise her feelings and emotions. And in some ways, she's disenfranchising herself. So we looked at some of the Psalms of lament, and she was quite shocked. There was a lot of grieving, there was a lot of emotion, and very stark emotion. And there was an enlightenment and freedom that lifted from her as she could see herself in the biblical text. And it's really reminding people that this is an essential part of who we are. Even our mysteries and our questions are an essential part of who we are. And what I do in my work is give people a place to bring all of that, right? It is my hope for society that we're just not rushing by to be perfect or make things better or make things normal, that we do pause enough to acknowledge the very complex things that are happening inside of our lives with our loved ones, as we all try to come together to make sense and to care for one another and to give each other permission to grieve, to lament, to mourn, right? Even anticipation of it. So that's what I offer. And I look forward to some of the other comments from my fellow panelists and the discussion that we're going to have later on. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share.
Dr. Armstrong, really appreciate your lucid and very helpful remarks, and the fact that you've offered so much of your pastoral experiences, your experience as a therapist. And I know at least I've already got some questions and ways of really drawing upon those in some conversation in just a few minutes. So thank you so much. Next, we will turn to Dr. Dawn DeVries, who will offer some reflections. Dawn, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sam. And thanks for this opportunity to be here. I have to admit, just as a way of beginning, that the invitation to participate in writing a piece for this number of interpretation came a little bit as a surprise to me, because perhaps unlike others on this panel, I don't think I have particular expertise in thinking about the topic of death or aging. It's not really what my scholarly work has been on up to this point, but when I got the invitation, I accepted it, and I kind of assumed that it came because my colleagues know what's going on in my life right now. So since there are many people tuned in who probably don't know what's going on in my life right now, I will tell you that I married somebody who is 30 years older than I am. I remember at the time that I was contemplating that offer to marry that person, that a friend of mine said to me, "Don't do this, Dawn. I don't want you to be a young widow." And I remember at the time just kind of chuckling to myself and thinking, nobody knows how long they're going to live, and I could die first, or we could both die together tomorrow, and that's not a good enough reason to say yes or no. And I didn't spend a lot of time worrying about our age difference when we got married. I was in my 20s, my husband was in his 50s. And really, honestly, for many of the years of our marriage, it was not an issue. But I have to confess that probably as he approached 80, things started to change. And I was aware that there was a lot more caregiving happening in our relationship. And that's a change that was difficult. But it got exacerbated more recently by the fact that he was diagnosed with dementia and with a recurrence of metastatic cancer. And so we're living with those things as a daily part of life. And I did not know quite how I wanted to approach the assignment to write something for this number. Because there's many things written about caregiving, and I'm still in the midst of it and still kind of a novice. And also some of it is just too raw for me to want to talk about in public in an article. But the more I thought about it, I thought I have a unique opportunity because of the age difference in our marriage. And that is to say, in the United States, I think we tend to warehouse our old people in communities where they're off with other people like them, and we visit them from time to time, or pick them up and take them home for Sunday dinner or something, and then back to the assisted living facility. And that means that our experience of what it looks like day to day to be struggling with the challenges of aging and often some serious disease issues that many older people are dealing with at that phase of life, we're not in on it. Caregivers that work in those facilities and doctors that work in those facilities get to witness the day to day. And some of them help us to understand that better, just in passing in conversation together or in things that they publish about that. But because this is not my parent or a grandparent, but my husband, the love of my life, and because I really we've always empathized with each other very much, what I felt like I wanted to talk about was what I was observing through looking at his experience with the eyes of love about what it's like to be in that phase of life that could last for weeks or days, or it could last for years. And for him, it has lasted for years now, where certainly your death is coming, and you kind of even know what pieces are bringing it forward as a reality. And yet you have to keep on living and have to continue to live. If you're a person of faith, you have to live with your faith and be in that relationship with God and others in the face of all the challenges that you experience. And I also just feel like in American culture, part of the reason that we warehouse old people is that some of the quotidian realities of aging at the end of life are really uncomfortable for us because they're so counter to the narrative of achievement that is very important in America. Like, pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, get ahead, work hard, achieve things, advance. And basically, what I observe in my husband, who was always a very competitive person in his own field of work and someone who worked very hard and achieved a lot, it is painful and spiritually difficult. That's what I would focus on. I think it is a spiritual challenge to absorb what you have to absorb at the end of life, which is letting go of so much of what may have defined your life up to that point. And so I find myself in admiration of him, sometimes grieving with him, and sad with him about all the things that are so much more difficult. And that's what I wrote about in my article. I'm not going to try and reprise all the parts to it, but I'm happy to talk about any part of that. I just think that being able to observe at close hand what elders are dealing with is a great gift, because it can help to give us all insight into what's really important in life, and to help us to develop our own spiritual resilience, as we will walk that path ourselves if God grants us life that continues into old age. So thanks, Sam.
Thanks very much, and appreciate both your writing the essay and sharing some of your own journey, both with us tonight and in your interpretation article. We will next turn to Joel Kaminsky. Joel, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I should probably start off by saying that I'm neither a Christian nor a pastor. I'm a Jewish person by faith stance. That's my religious community. And I think my students would tell you I'm more of a curmudgeon than a pastoral type. So let me talk a little bit. I don't know that I'm an expert on death and dying, but I'm somebody who likes to read widely, and I'm very interested in why our healthcare system is so screwed up. And I read a lot about, I've read, Atul Gawande's book on being mortal, and got interested in, I've read other literature that doctors have produced on death and dying. And I've also just thought a lot about it. The essay that I wrote grew out of a number of topics that I've touched on in my Bible classes. In my intro to the Bible, to the Hebrew Bible class, I regularly have a few lectures on Leviticus, and I'm fairly convinced that the section in Leviticus 12, 13, 14, and 15 that deal with childbirth, deal with leprosy, as it's called. I don't know that it's really leprosy, some sort of skin disease, deal with menstrual and seminal emissions and impurity from those sort of bodily emissions. I've been convinced for years that these passages are really about having miniature encounters with death while we're alive, and have made arguments in class for years that I'm not so sure that the ancient Israelites had it wrong and we have it right. There was some wisdom in that. Now, some of this probably comes out of the fact that I'm Jewish, and I happen to think that traditional Judaism does death extremely well. It's one of our strong suits. We do it well. There's a lot of literature on Jewish death and dying, and I think the sort of ritual process is intense and is very psychologically insightful, I think. So that's one piece of it. Another piece is that I think that I've spent time when I teach the wisdom literature materials, either in a wisdom class or as part of my intro to the Bible class or in seminars, where there are metaphors of life and death that are employed. And I don't think they're always to be taken literally. It's interesting. I've always brought this verse out, Proverbs 13:12, in class. I've usually discussed it because I think it's a classic example of proverbial wisdom, in terms of a number of Proverbs actually are quite terse, and they're actually closer to slideshows than they are verbal things. And this is like a 4-part slideshow. The first part is Tochelet Mimushcha, which means hope dragged along. And the second thing is Machala Lev, sick heart. There's not even an is. It just says hope deferred, sick heart. It's like A equals B. And then the third one says, Eitz Chaim, a tree of life, ta'ava ba'a, desire fulfilled. Now, I do not think that when Proverbs says that if hope is deferred, that you should visit a cardiologist because you have a sick heart. I think it's sort of saying something about how when hopes are crushed, we say, oh, so-and-so died of a broken heart, right? We understand that language, and I think that's what they're saying. And when it says desire fulfilled is a tree of life, I don't think the person who wrote Proverbs is saying, well, if you have a desire fulfilled, you live eternally. But he's evoking that as a sort of, it revivifies you. You're totally, in that moment when something you really hoped for comes to fulfillment, you are hyper alive. And so it made me start to think that, like, maybe they have some things to say about the ways in which we think about life and death. Oh, and one other point that I should make, and this comes from my mentor, from Professor Levinson, who's written a lot on this topic. He has a book, Resurrection and the Restoration of Life, where he talks about the roots of the notion of resurrection. He thinks lies deeper inside of Scripture. It didn't come out of nowhere. And one of the highlights that he underlines is that today we tend to think there's a sharp break between life and death. But in ancient Israel, they tended to think the sharp line was between life and severe illness. And that if you were severely ill, you were functionally dead. So this is another way in which when ancient Israelites went through life, and keep in mind, an ancient Israelite lived a lot shorter than we do. The average ancient Israelite maybe lived 40 years old. Average woman, less, because childbirth was a deadly proposition. And they might, over that course of that life, have 3 or 4 close encounters with death. Remember, there were no antibiotics. If you've got an infection, you might die from it. So when they encountered one of these experiences and recovered from it, it was like they died and came back to life. So I do think, as I read this contemporary literature on death and dying and started to reflect on things in the Bible, I felt like some of the models in the Bible might have things to say to us, particularly this idea that we should recognize that as we're aging and growing old and dying, that we're encountering death along the way and we're given a chance to try it on. I should mention, in Judaism, you're actually given an additional chance every year to try it on, because Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is a mock death, and you dress in all white like a burial shroud, and you fast because dead people don't eat, and you don't drink any water, and generally speaking, your bodily processes slow down because you're not eating and drinking, and you're praying to God to give you another year, because basically you're aware that you're not really worthy of that, and if God had his way with you, he'd call in his chits, but you're hoping he'll give you another year. So, I tried to bring together a number of these things in this essay, and probably a too complicated way to explain standing on one foot. But I'm interested in the topic. I'm curious what other people have to say. If anyone wants to see the essay, you should bug Sam or bug me. I'm happy to, or better yet, download it from your academic institution so Sam's journal gets paid for it. And I'm happy to talk more in the discussion section. I don't want to go on too long. I wasn't keeping track of how many minutes I've been yabbering for. So I think I'll step back and let the next person talk.
Well, appreciate it so much, Joel. Just a lot of food for thought. One of the things Joel talked about in his essay as well was the fact that the different relationship between death and life in ancient Israel made them much closer to death in terms of not just the lower life expectancy, but also the fact that just their theological and ethical outlook dealt more honestly, candidly, and daily with the reality of our mortality. So we look forward to talking about that some more in the Q&A part. So we move to Tom Long, who, as everybody here knows, has given us so much food for thought in terms of the witness of preaching, but he has also spent a good bit of time in writing and in speaking, talking about funerals And so that will add an important piece to our conversation. So Dr. Long, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to be here. In regard to this topic, my particular interest is the rapidly changing death rituals and funeral practices in America. And I'm interested in that in terms of the whole culture, but I'm have a particular focus on the Christian tradition. I want to advocate for reform in funeral practices in the Christian community because I think they have become in many ways deformed. I think this is true not only of the Christian tradition, as other faith traditions have collided with the American culture and its views of death. There have been losses and changes that are not good. But I'm going to stick within the Christian tradition as the one that I know the best. Funerals are, like a lot of basic human rituals, a combination of two things. They combine dealing with a basic human necessity, and they also are expressions of meaning. Embedded in the ritual practice are testimonies and convictions about what is life, what is death, what is the meaning of this that we're going through. And it took the Christian tradition 5 centuries to develop a basic funeral ritual. Obviously, they dealt with death, but they borrowed Roman and Jewish practices basically, and gradually refined them over time into a Christian ritual. It was still pretty allegiant to the Jewish heritage of the Christian church. And I agree with Joel that there is in the Jewish tradition a tremendous intensity of ritual and psychological depth, and that was carried over into the Christian practice. But by the 5th century, this is what it looked like. When a Christian was dying, those who loved this person would gather around the sickbed. They would engage in prayers. They would sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And when the person died, if it was a female, females would gather around the body. If it was a male, males would gather around the body and prepare the corpse. The eyes would be closed, the mouth would be closed, the body would be washed and anointed, and then wrapped in a white shroud, which is not only a conventional death shroud, but was for them a baptismal garment. Preferably before sundown, again borrowing from the Jewish tradition. During broad daylight, the body would be carried from the place of death to the place of burial. The Romans wore red and black clothes and had the procession at night with torches, but Christians did this in broad daylight, and the mourners wore white, again, baptismal garments. As they traveled to the place of burial, they would sing hymns and spiritual songs and psalms. And then when they got to the place of burial, they would have a Lord's Supper, a Eucharist. And as they always did, they would greet each other with a kiss, including the one who had died. They would kiss the wrapped shroud. This was the last Eucharist in this world and the first taste of the Messianic banquet. And then when the Eucharist had completed with tearful psalms and prayers, they would give the deceased into the hands of the God who had given the deceased to us. Now, notice the baptismal imagery that rolls all the way through here. When Elizabeth was baptized, she was washed and anointed, and now in her death, we wash and anoint her again. When Elizabeth was alive, we fed her at the table, and we feed the community once again. We walked this life with Elizabeth, bearing one another's burdens. And now we bear the burden of Elizabeth herself as we carry her to the place of farewell. It's a beautiful expression of the baptismal nature of the Christian life and the fact that Elizabeth is a baptized saint traveling to be into the life of God, and we are accompanying her with singing on the last mile of the way. Now, this rocked along pretty well until the 19th century. There were ups and downs, but it basically was the pattern until the 19th century. And white educated suburban Protestant Christians began to lose confidence in the ritual and the underlying convictions. A lot of complicated factors with that. The Civil War had something to do with it. This theology that was being expressed in the funeral works better when people die one by one rather than mass death on the fields of Virginia and Pennsylvania. Overwhelms the theology. There was a kind of literalism that had not changed. People had adjusted their views theologically of other theological and biblical language, but they kind of froze when it came to funerals and had a literalistic view of heaven and so on that couldn't withstand the assaults of intellectual development in the 19th century. So the funeral changed dramatically. I won't list all of the ways, but let me list a couple. First of all, Elizabeth disappeared from her own service. We're the first people in the history of the world for whom the dead are no longer welcomed at their own funerals. By and large, funerals have been replaced with bodiless memorial services. It's because the lack of theology that's there now can't bear the weight of a dead body. It simply defeats the new purpose of a funeral, which is grief management. And it's interesting to watch all the 19th century services begin to shift away from accompanying Elizabeth on her baptismal journey to the internal struggles and psychology of the mourner. All of a sudden, instead of being a procession, a piece of community liturgical theater in which we walk with Elizabeth to the place of farewell, we retreated to quiet sanctuaries where we began to think quietly about the meaning of life and death. In the piece that I wrote for interpretation, I point out various ways that we indicate we sort of have lost our way in terms of knowing what to do with the dead, from cremated remains being turned into tattoo ink or swirled into jewelry or pieces of furniture, to the proliferation of roadside shrines, not the completed journey, but the interrupted journey of death. And so I do a little advocating for a recovery of the deeper purposes of a Christian funeral. I'll close with a quotation from a friend of mine who's a funeral director, Thomas Lynch. He said, "A good funeral gets the dead where they need to go and the living where they need to be." Thanks, Sam.
Thanks so much, Tom. And we have already some excellent questions on funerals that really relate to what you've been talking about that we can get to in a few minutes. But before we do so, we definitely want to hear from our last speaker, Dr. Jim Wright, who gets the award for being in the latest hour where he's giving his remarks. Dr. Wright is a physician here in Richmond, but also an alum of Union Presbyterian Seminary. As many of you know or have read, he was at the forefront of fighting the pandemic in the retirement community that was hit hardest in Richmond and most tragically. So for his brave and just persistent work there, he is also a leading expert on care with patients with dementia, which is what he's going to focus on tonight. So, Dr. Wright, we're glad you're here and look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for having me tonight. Yeah, I'm a little bit different from the rest of the panelists. I know we're all different, but I am not and I don't try to be a professional theologian. Maybe I'm a semi-pro. But I spend most of my day in the practice of medicine, specifically with older folks in nursing homes. That's all I do. So I'm medical director of a facility called Westminster Canterbury in Richmond, as well as another one called Our Lady of Hope in Richmond. And I'm privileged to be part of the lives of many, many people with living with dementia and their families ushering them through the last years as they decline from the disease. So I like Trina and Dawn, and like many of our listeners have had personal experience in watching people suffer from dementia. And my particular interest now as a professional is trying to help with the quality of life, trying to improve the quality of life of elders living in facilities. And as Sam pointed out, I saw the worst of what can happen in facilities over the last 18 months. And part of my vision is what I call homecoming. It's a goal. The goal is to bring what we call a memory village to the United States. And I'm actually here in Amsterdam visiting the world's first memory village called Hoogvik. And happy to be here today to talk about my article. So I guess, my interest in death and dying, obviously come naturally through what I'm doing and my professional obligations to make sure that that I do the best that I can to provide as good a death as possible. And most of the time I do that. Sometimes I don't. But what I'm mostly interested in is how we can address this societal disregard and devaluing of people with dementia. And although, as Dawn pointed out in her article, there's many reasons why a diagnosis of dementia and a journey through dementia challenges your own sense of value and challenges the way others value you through loss of productivity. I feel that one of the reasons why our society devalues dementia is our belief in an innate immortal soul. And so my article deals with the ramifications of viewing humans as permanent through this immortal soul that we have. And in seminary, I was interested in the various Christian views, really the various biblical views of the soul. And interesting to me was the early Jewish concept of the nephesh. And so I called my article Resurrecting the Nephesh. And I feel that we would benefit as a society if we resurrected this Jewish concept of full mortality of the human being. So many of us as Christians hold a dualistic view of humans with a mortal body housing an immortal soul. And that belief is strained when you're seeing somebody go through the different stages of dementia. Sometimes people make it through dementia with some of their most integral part of their personalities intact. But many people that go through dementia lose what we see as their very essence, their sense of humor, their likes and their dislikes, their ability to speak well, their intelligence, certainly their work. And the person with dementia sometimes turns into an entirely different person. And the question then remains, when you believe in an immortal soul, well, if the immortal soul is supposed to be the very essence of who we are, then what good is it if you change totally throughout dementia? And so there's got to be a better explanation for what humans are. And I find that in the nephesh. So early Israel did believe that once you were dead, you were dead. You weren't going to some astral existence. This concept changed with time in the Jewish world, but Paul, especially in 1 Corinthians 15, does hark back to that Jewish concept of human mortality, and talks about how death is really the death of everything. We don't, in that particular, iteration of Paul's vision of what happens after death, humans fall like a seed into the ground. What happens later happens later. So there's no immediate release of an immortal soul in Paul's description of what happens to humans in death. And I think that's very appropriate for what we see happening in someone that's suffering from dementia. So how this ties in my view, in my article, how this ties into society's disregard and devaluing of people with dementia is that, dementia then is a failure of being permanent. It's a failure of this immortal soul concept. And so it's a failure, of what we see as being truly human. And so we can see this in families that will, kind of ignore their loved one in a facility as they go through the later stages of dementia. But, I think we also see it in how families and society tends to show how they value the former person, the person before they develop dementia, more so than the person as they're changing through the stages of dementia. So they value the previous person rather than the current person. And you can see that, I think the most common manifestation of that is around this time of year when we start seeing Alzheimer's walks. The Alzheimer's Association sponsors a walk to end Alzheimer's. And we put a lot of money, as Atul Gawande pointed out in his book, Being Immortal, we put a lot of money in staving off the inevitable and practicing or trying to practice a form of immortality by trying to defeat every disease that comes along. And now we're trying to cure dementia, imagining that there's going to be a survivor of dementia out there. And I really, that's a pipe dream, because that's like imagining that there's going to be an end to mortality. So if it's not Alzheimer's dementia, it will certainly be vascular dementia, one of the other types of dementia. Your brain will wear out. You will, if you live long enough, you will develop changes in the brain that will change you. So we tend to take people that have changed and become different people with dementia, and we do warehouse them and we remove them from society because we value the previous person rather than the person who is becoming someone different. And the point of my article was that if we could simply adopt this concept and internalize this concept of nephesh, resurrect this concept of nephesh, and become fully mortal, understanding all of us are fully mortal, then perhaps it would lead to a better appreciation of human beings as always changing, always decaying in some, in some form or the other, and helping society to then find out more about what these people with dementia are, who they are becoming. And so instead of having a walk to end Alzheimer's, then maybe we would have walks to honor those with Alzheimer's, to improve the quality of dementia units, to help to establish centers like I want to establish, memory villages where people live normally, instead of like failures. So I know it's challenging. I know it's challenging for a lot of people to divorce themselves from this later Christian concept of dualism and an immortal soul. But it's true. It's what happens. It's what I see certainly in my practice of medicine. And like Joel said before, the ancient Israel got a lot of things right, and I certainly think that's one of them. So thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Wright. Certainly, it's really interesting and a great thing that there's a lot of overlap, even though these were distinctive presentations. There's overlap, and I'm sure there's going to be a good bit of conversation and questions. I want to give panelists an opportunity to ask each other questions or to make comments based on the other presentations briefly. I did want to start off with one thing that I think comes out of something that both Dr. Wright and Dr. DeVries said, and I wanted to go back to Dr. Armstrong and just sort of ask, it was interesting, you talked about the ambiguity of suffering when a patient doesn't remember aspects of, and especially with dementia, and both Jim and Dawn talked about this. Jim mentioned them losing their very essence. I guess my question to you would be, as you counsel people, as you have taught pastoral care, just how you have confronted that in families of loved ones, and maybe some stubbornness about not embracing. No, embracing is not the right word. Accepting the changes of someone who's going through dementia, and how you've handled that in both your teaching and in your therapy sessions, especially related to relatives who are dealing with someone in their family who's got dementia.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In terms of the connection between what Dawn said and really a lot of what Dr. Wright said, and too, in terms of where I land, especially with my students, is this understanding of suffering. What does it mean to suffer? One of the most helpful books that I have read and also assigned in my pastoral care classes, a book that talked about pastoral responses to suffering and evil. And a part of that is to really think about, from a theological perspective, theodicy, right? And really coming to terms with the ways in which we make meaning out of that which we don't understand. And suffering is one of those things that we don't understand, especially when we encounter it. As long as we're not suffering or with anyone that's suffering, we don't think about it. But it's also a crisis of meaning. And so we talk a lot about the ways in which as we look at God, as if God is called, this death must mean God is teaching me something, or I must have done something wrong, or all of those ways in which really some of those biblical texts get misconstrued as a lens through which one makes sense out of what's happening to them, but that God is somehow orchestrating this in some ways. And so a lot of my work was really helping my students and those that I'm working with in a pastoral context to come to terms, to normalize death and suffering. Normalize it. This is what happens. Dr. Wright talked about that. Dawn, thank you so much for your poignant sharing. I've certainly had those moments of many deaths in my family where I've had to usher in this myself to be with people and to make sense of my own theology and my own losses in that. So Sam, really it's a lot of just helping people think about the reality of what they're seeing, to normalize it and not to use theology. And some of that's embedded theology, things that they've heard in their churches or in society. A lot of it's cultural messages that many of us sort of have interwoven in our sharing, right? And so I really create the kind of safety in those spaces, both in the classroom and my own caring spaces, that we can talk candidly about that. A lot of it is protecting ourselves from our own vulnerabilities, right? We don't want to sit with that. We want to keep ourselves safe. Many of us have been, hurt and harmed. And so when we have to encounter some of that stuff, it's not safe. It doesn't feel good. So we learn to protect ourselves from it. So I give people permission, right, to ask the kind of questions, to really liberate themselves from some of those things that keep them bound, right? And not in the essence of their humanity. And so I do it very gently and compassionately, because I know what that journey is like. It's very scary. So I honor that, right? I don't make assumptions about that, and really create the spaces where we can talk about that and provide each other support, because it does bring up a lot of thoughts and feelings that are often scary. And so that's pretty much my approach to it, both as a professor and also as a caregiver, and also as one who has encountered those journeys on a number of occasions and had to do my own spiritual work, my own spirituality, my own coming to terms with my immortality and facing it, for 7 years as a hospice chaplain, it just changes you. And so I was open to that. And so I help my students and my clients really do welcome that in their lives, but that they don't have to do it alone. That's the scariest part, that we believe that we're going to be alone in that nobody's going to be there. And so I try to model that being there, right? And also that they can be with themselves, so they don't have to throw themselves away from that process, right? That they can enter into that. So that's one of the ways, many of the ways that I try to work with this topic in both the classroom and also with those that I care for professionally. So
thank you so much. Very, very helpful.
Hey, Sam?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I? So I was like really intrigued with something that Dr. Kaminsky said about in the Hebrew scriptures, this idea of certain kind of things being little practice deaths or anticipations of death. And I think that's really important. And it also connects with what Dr. Wright was talking about our resistance to sort of seeing a self that's not permanent, and a self whose unfolding is not completely in our control. I think that's the piece that's so hard about dementia, because things outside of our ability to make decisions and be responsible or work really hard or whatever are going to evolve our sense of self. And I think both of those, the anticipation of death and the fact that actually aging, if you age long enough, you get a lot of chances to practice dying. I think that's kind of where I end my article, quoting a poem, really. But I think that's super interesting. And I think that because Americans are so death phobic, like we're going to avoid it at all cost, that we don't take advantage of the gift that is, because we all are going there, whether we know it or not. And it seems like life gives you an opportunity to practice dying, which is really let go. And then when you let go, that evolving identity that may end up being quite different than the self 50 years before or 20 years before or 5 years before isn't such a betrayal. It's just a kind of unfolding of identity in relationship. So I thought there were interesting things there as I put them together.
Mm-hmm.
I thought something of the same thing, if I could add just a word here, when Joel was talking about Leviticus being a kind of little experiment with death in the midst of life, and what Dawn talks about. I thought about the Ars Moriendi literature that was once well used in the Christian tradition, where you actually dress rehearsed your own death through devotional exercises. And that literature is making a little bit of a comeback in contemporary dress, and I think it's encouraging.
I think Joel had a comment, and then we're going to get to some questions that the audience is asking. Yeah, Joel, go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple things. Yeah, the contemporary comeback of the Ars Moriendi is L.S. Dugdale's book, which is called The Lost Art of Dying, where she writes like a contemporary view of death, trying to use some of those virtues. And of course, one of the interesting things that it brings up is most Americans say they want to have a quick death, and in the medieval era, that was viewed as a bad thing because you didn't have time to put your house in order. Now, the reality is most Americans don't have a quick death. This is one of the most interesting things of how we actually differ from not only ancient Israelites, but from everyone until about 50 years ago, which is, I've been reading this book. I ran into a student of mine on campus from a few years ago who turns out is doing an MPH or a PhD at GW in healthcare. And she recommended looking at this Joanne Lynn material. And Joanne Lynn points out that a mere 50 years ago, for all previous history, most people, 4 out of 5 people, died precipitously, very quickly. Some event happened and didn't necessarily was an instant, but it was pretty quick. But now 4 out of 5 Americans have extended periods in which they're dying, but we make believe that somehow or another that they're fully alive. Like if you have congestive heart failure, you could live with that for 20 years, but you are dying. And you actually have a reasonable chance of dying within 6 months, but you might live 20 years. So one of the points that she makes is that not only is our culture, but our healthcare system is completely misaligned with this sort of shift in circumstances. So we really need to have a look at, I mean, one of the points she makes is that things like hospice are only available the last 6 months, but the truth is they need to be available for 20 years for some people, because some people are at that cusp of 6 months, but they don't know what 6 months that is.
That's very helpful, Dr. Kaminsky. And one of the things you do so well in your essay is have some incisive discussion about how little conversation we've had in the healthcare industry and with families about this reality, and just that's just not, and that in a way that is less honest than what the biblical writers, the ancient Israelites, were engaged in. I want to turn to something that we have a whole bunch of questions about, and we'll go to Dr. Long first on this, and then see if others have comments. An earlier comment, Tom, was that, obviously there's widespread decisions among many, you've sort of alluded to this, not to have funerals at all, or to have life celebrations at bars or other such locations. So maybe comment on that, but also another question related is, can you give an idea of, and I know you mentioned this article, of how funerals should be conducted today in light of all that you talked about? Yeah,
the celebration of life phenomenon is, in my view, basically full range of the meaning of death. When somebody dies, there's a tragic aspect of it, and I think apropos of some of the things that we were talking about earlier, when somebody has a dementia, we feel very badly because they're going to be having an undignified death. We want to die with dignity, but death is itself an indignity, and part of the value of a funeral is that it says the partiality of every human being's story, the incompleteness of every human being's story, is now given the gift of a narrative that frames it and makes it whole. Death doesn't get the last word, and we act that out in the way we accompany the dead to the place of farewell. So in terms of how I'll be brief about this, how we should do a funeral, I think we should bring the deceased back into the funeral. There are all kinds of ways to do that. Sometimes it's impossible to do that, but as a customary thing, we should have the deceased there, or the cremated remains, something physical, embodied, and we should not try to make up whimsical stories about the deceased, as if suddenly they have become a humorous and fascinating person because we can tell only the charming little instance. But the life should be remembered as it is, a whole human life. And we give thanks to God for it. Even if it was a hard life, we give thanks to God for this life. And then we go all the way to the end. I was talking to a Muslim one time about my work on Christian funerals, and he said, "I don't understand Christians. You don't go all the way with the dead." And he said, "I am the one who is privileged to wash the bodies of the Muslim dead in my mosque, and we stay until the end." And I think that's good for the human spirit, to walk with the dead all the way to the place of farewell.
I think Joel has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Jews do washing of the body. Yeah, we definitely need to bring the body back into things. One of the most interesting points of this is that while Americans are increasingly, and this is even true of a lot of Jews, doing things like cremation, or now there's like these natural means of disposing of the body that are greener, supposedly. Um, uh, when a thing like 9/11 occurs, or when a war occurs, there's a lot of attention paid to, we must bring the bodies back. I need that body. So it's clear we haven't totally let go of it, because in certain tragic circumstances, God forbid a car accident or some plane accident, everyone wants the body of their beloved back, even though weirdly enough, a lot of those people might have cremated the body if the person just died naturally. But if they die unnaturally, they need the body back. So that is a place where I think our culture still has this fixation, which is, I'm not saying bad, I actually think it's good, this attachment to the corporeal sense of who we are as human beings.
Yeah, our humanity tells us that the bodies of the deceased are sacred.
Yeah.
But our cultural tutoring talks us out of that.
Yeah, it's an innate idea. In Judaism, one of the most powerful parts of the service is that when you put the coffin in the ground, the family physically throws dirt onto when you hear that dirt hit the coffin and that hollow sound, you realize you're burying your father or your brother or your mother. It really sort of, it forces you to come to terms with their mortality and your own mortality. And it's very potent. It definitely, I'm a big fan of the sort of earthiness of putting people into the ground. I think it's an important thing, and it's important for Jews, for Muslims, and for Christians. And precisely because all three of these traditions have this idea of the resurrection of the body. The part of our identity is attached to not just the soul, but the physical body.
Appreciate just excellent conversation. We have another question that may need to be a part 2 of a different webinar, asking about what becomes of the essence of the soul of the person, and how does that relate to the Christian faith, which is a huge question. I just would say just a couple of things about that. One is the diversity of perspective we get even in the New Testament on this question. The image of beatific immortality in Revelation differs significantly from what we get in the Gospel of Mark. The depiction of astral immortality that we get in Daniel 12 is significantly different from what we get in 1 Corinthians 15. So the diversity of perspectives on this among early Jews and Christians is notable. And we are, I guess I would also say, I teach a Death in the Afterlife course. We are heavily influenced in ways we do not know by films, books, Twilight Zone episodes, Dante's Inferno, things that are very much post-biblical that have shaped our popular consciousness on death in the afterlife. And so it would be interesting and we could go down all those different depictions. Maybe that could be a webinar part 2 where we talk about how the afterlife is portrayed. But it's a good question, but see if anybody else wants to follow up on that. I would just point to the diversity.
I would say you're right, Sam, of course, and we've had this discussion before, but I think, questions like that, highlight the difficulty in discarding of the notion of immediate immortality, of an innate immortality. And I do think it's important to wrestle with that, to look at God as the only immortal and to look at humans as fully mortal. And if we were to do that, it would still be biblical. And it would enable us perhaps to come to terms with some of the issues we're talking about, with our own mortality, with a willingness to sign on to hospice, to forego extensive medical interventions, expensive medical interventions that may not add much quality if they do add quantity to life. So you know, even though it is biblical, I think it's still important to talk about how that interferes with being truly human and grasping the nature of mortality and what it means. It's a beautiful thing to be mortal, and it's a beautiful thing to identify that mortality in yourself, because it allows you to stop ignoring death and the approaching end to everything you are. So, I would answer, what happens to the essence? Well, it turns to jelly, and then it turns to dust, and then it disappears, and then we believe as Christians it's raised sometime in the future.
Excellent addition. Does anybody else want to follow up on that? I don't want to preclude any other conversation on that. We did have a question for clarification, Joel. If you could send, maybe you already did, the Moriendi book. What's the title?
Look in the comments. The Lost Art of Dying. Do you see it? I put it in the comments. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'd missed that.
I just put it in.
Yeah, appreciate that. So The Lost Art of Dying. Thanks so much. Let's see. There may have been another question up here. There's a bunch of comments. Do any of we have about maybe five more minutes, and then we need to stop. Do any of the panelists want to add anything based on the discussions of the other presentations? I asked a question, but I didn't sort of give open-ended chance to respond. Does anybody on the panel want to make any final comments about the topic or any of what has been said so far? Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, well, I would sort of push on Jim Wright a little bit. I'm not really sure that I agree that in the Hebrew Bible, the nephesh is generally embodied, but I don't know that when bodies are buried that the average ancient Israelite thought of the dead being totally dead like we think of the dead being dead. That is part of the point that Levinson makes in this book, Resurrection and the Restoration of Life, which is the reason why being direly ill is equivalent to being dead, is because being dead is like being direly ill. So the dead in ancient Israel had a very, very, very low form of life, but they weren't exactly dead like we think of dead people. And that's why there was a sort of cult of the dead where people often fed their relatives and wanted relatives buried on the ancestral plot. So I don't know that I would say that it's exactly the way that we think of dead being dead. But
I would agree with you, Joel. I mean, I think people, right. I mean, I'm thinking of the story of Solomon, and there was an unconsciousness, I guess, an internal unconsciousness of sleep. Was how it was described, I think, in a lot of ancient Israel scripture. Just not. I guess my point is that death did not involve a release of an immortal conscious soul from a mortal body. I mean,
I agree that there's not a full-blown developed idea that somehow or another there's some part of ourselves, and generally speaking, this is whatever when Ezekiel pictures the people of Israel coming back to life, he pictures the valley of dry bones and the bones being resurrected and given flesh and muscle and reanimated, because you need the body and the animating spirit of the body are attached to each other.
There's also what I think is a somewhat humorous story in the midst of warfare that relates to this topic that sometimes we overlook. There's the story in which, David is pressing in upon Saul, and Saul is worried about what's going to happen, and he goes to see the medium and raises Samuel up to have a conversation. And Samuel says, "I would rather have stayed asleep than have to talk to you, buddy."
Yeah.
And and then he proceeds to tell him that the battle is not going to be his, but it does indicate that there were.
That's what I was Samuel, not Solomon. Sorry.
Samuel.
I think that's what I thought you were referring to.
Yeah.
Tim, can you
rusty sometimes?
Maybe you could give us. I know you're maybe just a minute of what you envision. What you envision bringing to Richmond in terms of what Alzheimer's patients might experience and how that would work, because I think that would be helpful for people to hear before we stop.
Yeah, gosh, thanks, Sam. I did put my the website in the chat just in case anyone's interested. But so what we're looking at doing as homecoming is to bring it's a memory village. So what this would look like would be groups of elders living in houses of perhaps 6 to 8. And the houses would be on a campus of around 12 to 15 acres. And one of the primary goals of our group is to return the lost freedom to those with dementia. Many people with dementia that go to memory centers, at least, or even at home, lose the ability to simply, put their hand on a doorknob, open it, and walk out, and to chart their own path. And so it would be a substantial outdoor space. In that space would be all the elements of a small village life. And kind of the heart of the village would be the grocery store and the cafe. And that would allow people to, again, restore the loss of purpose. Many people with dementia in dementia centers do plenty of activities, but most of those activities, almost all of them, are leisure activities, purposeless activities. So the loss of purpose would be something else we're trying to restore, with the ability to go to the store, to shop with your guide, to take those products back to your home, help to prepare meals, so restore some of the rhythms of natural life. And then finally, to restore community. So on campus, there would be community amenities that would attract the outside community into our memory village, a daycare specifically, a restaurant or a food hall, and then a great playground and a dog park, so that people normally that would have nothing to do with folks living with dementia would be drawn to campus and restore community into the lives of people living with dementia. So the three losses we try to restore are freedom, purpose, and community. So check us out if you're interested.
Well, blessings on that important work. And I think that's a hopeful way to end our webinar tonight. I know folks, we started a bit later tonight, so getting on towards 9 o'clock, you may have dinners you want to finish or sports you want to watch. So we can let everybody move on with their evening. But we're so grateful for the widespread participation from alums and pastors from all over the country. We thank you for identifying yourselves in the chat, and just a special word of thanks to our 5 excellent panelists. This has been recorded and will be available for others to watch. If you know of folks who couldn't make it tonight, I know of quite a few. So we will make sure to share that, and you can feel free to share it with anybody you wish. So kudos to all of our panelists tonight. And I hope everybody has a pleasant night and a wonderful weekend, and that you stay safe. And we'll look forward to having you join us on the next one of these. Take care, everybody.